I'm Leanne Tran, psychologist who's worked with families whose kids don't fit the mould for almost 20 years. I've worked with children for decades, but I know parents are the real change makers when it comes to their kids. Having 3 kids of my own means I know it's not easy. Parent Like a Psychologist is all about simplifying how you support your kids with psychology information filtered through years of experience to take you from overwhelmed to confident. Come on in. So welcome everybody to another episode of Parent Like a Psychologist. Today I'm very excited to be talking with Tammy Schamuhn from the Institute of Child Psychology. You, Tammy, are a psychologist as well, so you've combined my favorite things here with being able to talk about children and their development, but also being able to talk about books, because that is another thing that I love. So thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So for parents to have a little bit of an idea about Tammy, she's the co-founder of the Institute of Child Psychology. You also have a podcast called the Child Psych Podcast, which is another great resource for parents. So you are a psychologist, but also a registered play therapist supervisor. And so you have done lots of work with families in person, working in counselling centres and that kind of thing, in private practice in Canada, Alberta, for the last, decade or so. And so your description says that you approach your clinical and educational work with parents with an attachment and neurobiological lens, which is, brain or neurobiology, so brain biology for parents out there. And I love that it's your work is really designed to incorporate that child neurobiology, but in a way that's really easy for parents to understand. So it's really backed in that research about how kids work, but in a way accessible to parents. I think you do that really well through the book. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, how did you, it's usually a question I ask people to start with. How did you come to be, and so, sorry, I should mention, you said before that anxiety and talking about child anxiety is what really drew you to starting your podcast and doing all of that kind of stuff. What drew you into this work with children? How did you get there?
Oh, I was a kid who needed to see a therapist.
Right.
So, parent come from a high, if you're familiar with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, my ACE score is very high.
Okay.
So yes, lots of trauma in my childhood. So that's kind of how I came into this work. I had some really great therapists, but some really bad ones too.
Right.
And I decided to be an educator before I became a psychologist. So I had worked with kids in a classroom setting in very low income schools with a lot of kids who are struggling, especially with trauma. I didn't know it at the time that that's what it was, but it now makes a lot more conceptual sense what was going on with these kids.
Right.
And to me, I went back to school. I was going to work with couples. And then I got a job working with kids after my master's degree. And it just clicked because I had had such an extensive background working with kids, and I had been in therapy, and I really wanted to help. I just thought initially I'd be helping adults, and then it just clicked actually much more when I started working with kids, that I was supposed to be doing that, not working with adults, unless it was in a consulting capacity.
Right.
It just felt right. And I was like, oh, this path makes more sense to me now, because of my education background, that it was just easy to to understand kids.
Yeah.
And then I loved working with parents, especially the parents who wanted help.
Yes.
Versus some of my resistant parents were a little harder. And I did a lot of work with high conflict divorce, child and family services. So kids like in foster care and adoptive care, and, those kinds of pieces, kids who have been apprehended. And so I did a lot of work with trauma. It's diverse. I do a lot of therapy that involves animal assisted therapy, and a lot of play therapy and EMDR for complex trauma. So I have a really, really vested interest in not only anxiety, but also working with trauma in developmentally appropriate ways with kiddos.
Yeah, it sounds like you've really got that keen desire to help kids who really need help and therapy. And I can see how, that's what drew you into the work. Yeah, I find the same thing. It's amazing working with kids. They're so much fun, I think, and so resilient and interesting. So,
Yeah, there's just a lot of therapists who mean well and they love their work with kids, but when you understand the brain and how kids really work, you really delve into the developmental psychology aspect of it, you realize that a lot of the therapy out there is very inappropriate for kids. So
mm,
it's just not suitable. So to me, my vested interest was finding therapies that were aligned with the science, that would align with the child's development, especially kids with complex issues. So that is what we really try to promote, is developmentally appropriate therapies for kids, because there's a lot out there that work for adults, but they're not designed for kids.
yeah. And I do mean to talk with you today about the brain and the way you describe that in the book, which is so easy to understand as a parent, I think, and discipline as well. But I'm particularly how it relates to that, what's developmentally appropriate. But coming back to, it's a really interesting idea, I think, for parents to hear about. What would you say to parents who are choosing what intervention to, or who to take their children to for help? How would they be able to tell between somebody who's doing the work that's appropriate and someone who's doing things that don't quite fit for kids?
Yeah. Well, understanding that kids are very much in their right hemisphere, not their left hemisphere. So their left hemisphere is all about language, and the right is all about creativity and emotion and intuition, and movement and kinesthetics. And so any therapies that really relate to the body, relate to play, relate to movement, relate to relationships, attachment, is going to
Mm,
be how is the key to their heart. It's the key to their development. What is probably not appropriate for kids is very cognitive based therapies, a lot of talk therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. If a therapist, you can bring a 6-year-old to a therapist's office and they have the kid sit on a couch, that's probably a problem. Like right away, I'd be like,
right.
they should be setting them on a couch.
Yes.
So to me is just looking at how that brain formulates, and that the child is really in their brain stem and their limbic system. And the brain stem is all about the body, and it's the limbic system is all about the feelings and relationships. And so between those two, whatever we're going to do is going to be creative. It is going to be movement based, relational based, and not, believe it or not, not a heck of a lot of talking. And that's
Mm-hmm.
hard for a lot of therapists. They rely on their left brain a lot, and the therapies appropriate for kids are not that. So I'm a registered play therapist, and I'm also an animal assisted therapist. So, and I am trained in circle security and theraplay. So these are, theraplay is a play based therapy, between the parent, the child, and the therapist. And then play therapy is done in a playroom with toys and art and puzzles and all kinds of things. And then your animal assisted therapy, which I run a ranch here with therapists, psychologists here who use horses and dogs and cats and goats and sheep and donkeys and chickens. And it's through the biofeedback they receive from the animals and the attachment and the narrative that they get from working with the animals that children start to open up and process, and they develop competency and regulation skills and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, it's just knowing what kind of therapies are appropriate for kiddos. So I always say, like, somebody who has training, and they actually have training in play therapy, theraplay is a good one. Animal assisted therapy is really great. Art therapy is another one that is very appropriate for kids, I would say.
Mm. So it sounds like too, what parents might look for is what a match between what their kids do at home in terms of playing to, and working through their challenges by playing and having fun, that's the same kind of thing that is happening in the therapy rather than lots of talking.
Yeah, I mean, there is talking and tracking, and
Yeah.
kids will kind of bring stuff up and we'll create parallels in those pieces. But the idea is the child knows how to lead for the most part. We won't get into too depth. Sometimes that doesn't work. But for the most part, kids, if given the right circumstances, move towards healing. It's up to
Mm,
us as adults to provide the right circumstances in which the brain can heal. And then we often miss the mark when we start looking at children as adults And even adults would get it wrong a lot of the time when we understand, once we know how the brain works and where the damage can happen with, especially with trauma or kids who are neurodivergent. Again, we miss the mark by trying to talk at what's going on for them. And they need to, experience kind of their authentic self within the therapy. And they have to do this so creatively and kinesthetically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you've mentioned the brain a couple of times, and I think, and we've talked before we started recording about how I've often am working with neurodivergent kids, so ADHD and autism are different brain types, but then so again are those kids who have that complex trauma like you talked about as well. But the brain develops in the same way, and those principles can apply or do apply to all kids, but in my view, it's just, they're all at a different developmental stage, and it can be applied differently according to kids' own interests and strengths. But tell us a little bit about the brain model that you have in the book and how you think it applies to all these different types of kids.
Yeah. And I mean, we can apply this to adults too. You can apply this to your dog. Like I work with mammals, I train horses and dogs. And it's so interesting to see how this even can be drawn throughout the different species as well. So now granted, human beings have a much stronger thinking brain than most mammals do, unless you're working with like dolphins or or a monkey. But the idea is, and this is just to be very clear, this is a culmination of work like Dr. Dan Siegel, Dr. Bruce Perry, Stephen Porges, Pat Ogden. Like there's many, many clinicians that contributed to. I just want to be clear. It's not original. We just found ways to culminate many different therapists' work into the book. And so the really simple way is to think of it as 3 sections of the brain. And this, I think that Dr. Dan Siegel was the first to come up with the 3 floors. And we just named them a little differently. And essentially, when we think of how the brain develops, what develops first is the brain stem, which we just call the body brain. It's in charge of your body. And this is all about, it's unconscious. It's just your body working, like your immune system functioning, your breath in and out, your vision, all of these things. So this is really just what's going on from the neck down, essentially. And this part of the brain develops first. It's fairly well formed at birth, minus your occipital lobe, which takes a little bit longer. Your vision takes quite a bit longer to develop compared to most of your brain. And since we have most of it developed, it's very strong, right? It's been also developing the longest in humans than any other part of the brain. So it is just got a real strong hold on human beings. And its preoccupation is always keeping us safe. And safety is always its number one goal. Like as the amount of amazing things human brain can do, we can write symphonies and develop skyscrapers and develop apps and write books. Yeah. But ultimately, we can't do those things if we don't stay alive. And so our brain is always defaulting to like safety, physiological safety, emotional safety, all the safeties. Like I got to feel safe in my body. I have to feel safe in my relationships. And so that question is always first. And I think what happens is we as parents jump to sometimes relationship and love and connection, or jump to the child's reasoning skills. And those are the other 2 floors we'll talk about. But what I think gets forgotten about is that children are so much in their bodies that and because the other 2 floors are very underdeveloped in contrast, kids are often overwhelmed by the things that adults aren't overwhelmed with in the same way. Now, you work with neurodivergent kids, that well. Like if you have a child with sensory sensitivities, if they feel overwhelmed by lights and sounds and tactile pieces, too many transitions, that lower brain is on high alert, right? It is not, it's saying, I'm not safe in my environment or my body. And this is going to cause a lot of issues. That child is just preoccupied with, I need to keep myself safe. And I'm going to do that however I can. We can also think of this part of the brain is governed by whether the child is getting proper nutrition, whether that child gets adequate sleep, whether that child has a food allergy, whether that child has had multiple transitions that day, whether they, there's so many things that navigate this sense of safety. Because ultimately, if you think about it, from our evolution, and we lived outdoors in caves, on the plains, wherever we developed in forests, there were predators, there were avalanches, there were forest fires. There's all of these things that a young child is very vulnerable to. And if
Yes.
we think
Yeah.
about how predators work, they pick off the young sick or the sick ones first.
Yes.
And so kids are constantly aware that they are not adults. They can't fully protect themselves and they have to
Yeah.
rely on their adults. And so when kids get tired or when kids are overstimulated, it's so much more. The filter in their brain doesn't work very well. That's a different part of the brain that's very underdeveloped in children, is that filter. So it comes from your hypothalamus and then your hippocampus. There's kind of like these sensory gating experiences that happen in the brain. So again, so whenever kids are having issues, the first thing we're always asking, first question that body brain is saying is, am I safe? And most parents will be like, well, of course they're safe. They're in my house and I'm not yelling at them. Like, they're fine. And I said, well, how many transitions did they have that day? Or, is there a new sibling in the house that has overwhelmed them because they're not getting the same connection from you? Or, is there a new teacher at school? What change has happened in their environment that's overwhelming their body? And some of these things get overlooked with parents, I think, because often kids are different. You've got different siblings and one can handle a lot of sensory experiences. They can handle a little less sleep. And you've got another kid who needs an extra 3 hours of sleep than the other one does. Right. So I think that's that first thing. And I always say, like, you got to zoom out and chase the why. Like, the first question we say is like, is your child in overwhelm? Because if they are, we can't focus on anything else except that safety. And then Dr. Stephen Ford just calls that neuroception of safety. Right. And those cues for safety come from within the body, within the relationship, and within the environment. So can be cues from the environment, cues from our caregivers or whoever we're interacting with, and then the internal sensations that exist within our body. And that can be allergies, it can be overwhelm, it can be I'm sick, I'm tired, whatever that is. And so we're always looking first and foremost at that base of that brain is safety. The next question the brain asks is, do I feel loved? And that comes from your limbic system. That's the middle of your brain. And it is all about attachment, relationships, and emotions. And embedded right smack dab in the middle of that limbic system is your amygdala, which is the smoke detector of your brain. And that emotional brain is always scanning the environment, helping the brainstem with that neuroception of safety. Am I safe? So it kind of answers, those two parts actually work together. So it's interesting that we have our emotions and our memory and our relationships come from that limbic system. But the cues for am I safe actually work together with that limbic system. That amygdala is the one who's also sensing, like, is everything okay? So then we go into, if it's not, we go into a state of stress, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse, those kind of pieces. So that limbic system is not only is it sending messages to the downstairs lower part saying, am I safe? It's really saying, am I loved? And the reason why this is so imperative is love is the child's number one shield. If they have attachment, if they have connection to their caregiver, that is how they derive safety. That's how they derive regulation, because they need adults to protect them, to feed them, to clothe them, to love them. And the brain doesn't develop properly without love. We know this. We see this in all the research on failure to thrive. You can provide a child's basic needs for clothing and food and sleep, but without love and connection and eye contact and soothing and that humming and singing and talking, we see ADHD-like symptoms. We see degradation of the gray and white matter in the brain, especially your prefrontal cortex, which we look at a lot of ADHD symptoms are mimicked when we have this failure to thrive in early developmental trauma. That most of these kids will have that symptomology. Now, that doesn't mean every child with ADHD has like complex developmental trauma, but it being aware of that will cause significant improvements.
And it shows the really big impact that has on children and their development, needing that co-regulation and safety, right?
Yeah. Kids need, oh, sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to say, often as psychologists, we talk about how as humans, we are wired to be social and connected with others. And I can see how that fits in this context that there's lots of safety that comes from being social. But I love how you talk about how also, I forget that we are also wired to survive as well. So those two lower levels do really work together closely.
Absolutely. And that's where we derive our sense of self inadequacy and saying, like, am I good? Am I lovable? No matter what to my caregiver, if that makes sense. Like, no matter what emotion I show, no matter what behavior I present with, will my caregiver accept who I am? And that's part of like
Yeah.
the equation with that limbic system
Mm.
is it's okay as a parent to set limits on behavior, but ultimately is the message that we give our children that I love you despite this. I can separate your behavior or your emotions from who you are. Emotions are fleeting, they come and go. The behavior is a result of a child feeling probably not feeling good, not feeling safe, feeling overwhelmed. And so the messages, and this comes to discipline, is no matter what our discipline is, the underlying message is always you're loved, you're
Yep.
accepted, you are safe with me. And that's what we want to make sure when we work with kids who are very dysregulated, that that is on the forefront of our mind, is that underlying message of unconditional positive regard is always at the forefront of what we do, is that compassionate response, that they have a brain that is very underdeveloped and they are doing the best they can with the limited tool set that they have in that moment.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry for my coughing attacks here. I've been recovering from a cold. Um, yeah, I think that's so true. I think I'm thinking about what you said before about how we perceive that differently as adults. And so sometimes we can look around and think that the kids are safe, but we really need to try and see it from their point of view, either by talking to them about it or just like you were saying, thinking about what the reason is, what the why is as to whether they are safe or not, because we can, you know, just not pick up on some of those things sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And when
I'm Leanne Tran, psychologist who's worked with families whose kids don't fit the mold for almost 20 years. I've worked with children for decades, but I know parents are the real change makers when it comes to their kids. Having 3 kids of my own means I know it's not easy. Parent Like a Psychologist is all about simplifying how you support your kids with psychology information filtered through years of experience to take you from overwhelmed to confident. Come on in. Thanks for listening to this episode of Parent Like a Psychologist. If you found it helpful, please share on Instagram so other parents can benefit too, and tag me at Leanne Tran Psychology so that I can say a big thank you. Head over to leannetran.com.au to join the village for bite-sized psychology tips straight to your inbox. I really hope this podcast has brought a new perspective and you a step closer towards a calm parent and a thriving child. Have a delightful day.